Hello, I'm David Tao, and welcome to the Theories of Everything program. Viewers, this is the third program in our big picture series, Theories of Civilization, in which we examine the ebbs and flows of life by humans on this planet from the very beginnings, around about 150,000 years ago, to the present time and beyond. In this series, we've so far examined the early progress made by humans towards civilization. And the key part of that process was around about 12,000 years ago, at the end of the big melt, at the end of the glaciation period, when humans finally decided to change from being hunter-gatherers to become basically farmers, farming the land, because the land was incredibly rich at that time in all the major river deltas in which the big melt had occurred across the planet. So they decided that it was time to settle down, farm these crops, farm these early cereals, and that gave them free time to develop other skills and to take advantage of the enormous brain power that they had developed in the latest mutations that occurred around about that period, 150,000 years ago. Now, they developed, in fact, the same cognitive skills as we have today, and they could apply them in the same ways that we do. They could apply them to crafts and arts, and in fact they needed to develop the basic artefacts of modern civilization, writing systems, number systems, advances in their language as well, and that's what they did. And they did it highly successfully, because by around about 7,000 years ago, they had developed the first writing forms, the first pictographs, in which they coded information about their crops and animals and their basic record keeping. They coded them in the form of simple pictures on clay tablets. One of the very interesting things that we discovered in that first program was a certain commonality between these different proto-civilizations. Whether it was from Egypt or whether it was from China, we discovered that they went through certain processes which were common. Because they all had to develop some form of administrative system, some form of record keeping to keep track of their crops and who owned them. So they developed writing. They all developed alphabets and numbers, whether they were in the forms of hieroglyphs, as in India, or the Maya culture in central Mexico, or whether they were in the form of pictographs, such as in China or the Middle East. Or regardless, they all developed some sort of system of alphabet and numbers, of writing and numbers. In all civilizations, they developed infrastructure. They developed similar forms of cities, towns. They developed similar large public works. They all developed walls, similar types of buildings, such as palaces, for example, and large shrines, such as the pyramids and ziggurats. In all the civilizations, their infrastructure, including their social infrastructure, was also similar. They developed a stratification of society. They had people who ploughed the fields, those who did crafts, and those who became the clergy, and also the bureaucrats, and also eventually some form of leader, some form of ruler or king. They varied in these modes, but broadly they had these similar patterns. So this is very interesting, and in all cases, the major key towns or cities that emerged on key trading routes in the key trading networks, which were vital for their survival, they soon found out, developed clusters of other towns, cities, tribes around them, and became key nodes in the network. They became key city-states, key hubs, if you like, in each civilization. But in all cases, the function of the city-state emerged, the key leading state that was able to form the nucleus of a proto-empire. Now, viewers, in our previous program we examined broadly these empires. We looked at the way they had commenced, the way they had evolved, and how they each in turn had declined, been conquered by other empires, mainly because of internal civil unrest, sometimes because of natural factors had also a role to play, such as drought or floods. In other words, weather it was chaotic even in those times, especially the El Nino effect, which was a major one around about 6,000 years ago, which had a devastating effect on a number of areas, in the Middle East, Egypt, Crete, etc. And but also because as each new empire strengthened, they looked to expand their territory, looked to expand their resources. So we have in the Middle East several major empires commencing, and of course a lot of them, most of them sort of had their genesis around about 5,000 years ago, with earlier tribes in the Middle East, Sumerians, Akkadians, Hurrians, and the first sort of broad proto-empire was the Hittites, which kicked off around about 3,600 years ago, lasted about 1,000 years ago. Then the Assyrians unified that area around about 2650, followed then by the Babylonians, who were successful in conquering the Assyrians. Babylonia became the major hub and the major empire at the time. And it was there was a fairly sophisticated sort of government, centralised government, raising taxes again, keeping good records, cuneiform writing system. But eventually, around 2540, the Persian Empire conquered that area, extended their brief. So, and the Persian Empire again had its genesis around about, well, a little later, around 4,500 years ago, with the early city-states fighting it out, but became unified around under Darius, who was a very good administrator, apparently, eventually, around about 2,500 years ago. Earlier tribes in Persia, or present-day Iran, migrated from southern Russia. Indo-Europeans, for example, Aryan tribes, coalesced and eventually formed these empires. The Persian Empire, of course, wasn't just content with conquering the Middle East, but also attacked Egypt. Around about 500 BC or 2,500 years ago, Egypt retaliated and freed itself about 100 years later. But in the meantime, the Greek Empire under Alexander had been expanding. The Greeks had reformed themselves from the early Greek states about 2,800 years ago, and Athens and Sparta fought it out for the dominant state. Become the dominant state, and around 2,600 years ago went through a political reform process, the genesis of democracy, the Athenian polity, for example, but became unified. Usually these empires become unified under one particular ruler, and in this case Philip II of Macedon unified these warring city-states, focused around, by this time, Athens, particularly Athens. And eventually his son Alexander the Great, developed a massive empire, including defeating the Persians around 2331. He actually burnt Persepolis, major city, because the Persians had done that to Athens about 150 years before, so he returned the compliment. The Greek Empire was massive. It extended from North Africa across Babylonia, across Persia, Asia Minor, Syria, and right across to India eventually. But in war, eventually everyone seems to end up pretty dead, and that's what happened to Alexander. And after that, this Hellenic, so-called Hellenic Empire, unified under Philip, collapsed. There were civil wars for about 300 years, and in fact the Roman Empire had been building up around that time, and they'd been protective of Greece. They were very much in awe of Greece and its culture. They admired it exceedingly, so for a while they supported Greece in its battles with other states, its survival. But eventually they became eventually a province under Rome, but eventually they took the whole lot over around about 133 BC, 2133 years ago. So you can see this flow and sequence of each group developing, but and eventually reaching peak strength and then conquering the previous empires that had built up and started to decay. They'd started to decay again through civil strife, leaders getting too greedy, power dissipating, sometimes being split, becoming unmanageable, in other words, and managing empires was really a very hard task. And remember, humans had only learnt to read and write 2,000 years before that, and only started to farm 5,000 years before that, so they had to go through this enormous learning process of how to consolidate power, how to manage, how to administer, and how to look after everyone. Because if they favoured just a few, eventually the ones at the bottom, the peasants, the plebeians, whatever you might call them, eventually rose up and said, we want our share as well. Now viewers, we might backtrack a little bit here, because this is where history gets interesting. We're discovering, in fact, another major pattern, because in amongst all these huge ebbs and flows of humanity across Europe, across Asia, and across the Americas, in fact, across all parts of the planet, in amongst all that, in amongst all the trillions of events and wars and kings and dynasties and so forth, there's something underlying history. And that is the flow of information, the accrual of knowledge through the culture of each of these empires, for example, of each of these groups of humans. They're developing a better understanding of themselves, about an understanding of themselves in relation to their environment, better ways of living, better ways of utilising the natural environment so that they enjoy a better quality of life. They're starting to get well and truly into the symbolic arts of literature and poetry and philosophy and mathematics. There's a continuing surge of knowledge and information in the substrata, if you like, beneath all the wars and flows of individuals. Also, of course, viewers, there was the knowledge on how to run empires, on how to run states. And the Greeks were very good at that because, remember, they introduced the whole concept of democracy, making it an inclusive process for everyone, which brought about a lot more stability and gave everyone a voice so that there was less conflict. Now, the Romans also attempted to do that through their republic. The patricians and the plebeians were brought together. The lower classes and the upper classes were brought together as well. They developed each of these major empires, each of these major civilizations developed a great code of knowledge on how to administer and how to better run these sorts of empires. Alexander, for example, was exceptionally good at it. He tried, and all the great statesmen were, all the great leaders, in some way co-opted the peoples that they'd conquered. They didn't try to change their religions, they didn't try to change their culture. They brought it in and combined it with, for example, the Hellenistic culture or the Roman culture. They made it a cooperative empire, and therefore they obtained the allegiance of those that they had conquered in a much stronger way. And therefore those empires did last a long time and were quite cohesive, again, until internal politics, the great leaders died and others took their place, and the cohesiveness and the knowledge was lost in many cases. Now, in terms of culture, when the Romans conquered Greece, they of course incorporated, and always had incorporated, Greek culture. They weren't as creative as the Greeks, but what they did do was very good. They actually categorised and accumulated all the knowledge, all the Greek knowledge. They basically brought it into a common form and translated it, and they disseminated it across Europe. Of course, they did have their own poets. They had poets like Virgil. They had their own philosophies such as the Epicurean philosophy. And of course, in their architecture, they developed further from the Greek architecture and developed, for example, much more massive buildings. They also developed, by the way, concrete. The first civilization to develop this much stronger material so that they could develop larger structures, larger domes. So they were very good at applying knowledge, the Romans. And of course they also were very good at codifying law. The way they codified and unified the whole structure of the law, they saw as very important in running an empire. So viewers, we come to a very, very critical time in human history. We come to the period around about 500 AD, 1500 years ago, when the old empires are in decline. The old Egyptian empires, Middle East empires, Persian, Greco-Roman Empire are in decline for various reasons, and the new players are coming in. The new players have come in from the east and come from the north. the Germanic tribes, the Goths, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Lombards, Franks have taken over that old Roman section, the Western European section of the Greco-Roman Empire. In the east, the Persians, dominated by Greek or incorporating Greek culture, have hived off the Byzantine Empire, if you like, which became a major trading hub, with Constantinople as the major trading hub in Europe and commercial hub. So that was a very strong empire and lasted for 1,000 years until the Turks took it over, conquered it. And then in the middle, under the new religion of Islam, developed the new Muslim empire, the new Arabian empire. Both these, the Byzantine and the Arabian, encouraged diversity. They encouraged diversity of ideas and traders. They realised that they could learn from all the different types of culture that had permeated modern civilization to that point. And they became a lot stronger for it. Baghdad became a major hub, of course, in the new Arabian Muslim empire. And of course they developed sophisticated mathematics, some drawn from India. The new systems of algebra, the Arabian number systems, also incorporating zero from India, the concept of zero, which became the basis, of course, for modern mathematics, the modern calculus, later in the 15th, 16th centuries. So all this happened in those two empires, but in the western section, trade declined, there were wars, conflict again between the Germanic tribes. They didn't know how to manage, they didn't know how to build an empire, so trading routes, towns declined. All the knowledge that had been built up in the early Greco-Roman Empire disappeared to a large extent, and they had to learn afresh. However, eventually, towards 900 AD, 1000 AD, there was a resurgence, and medieval culture developed in that time, new systems of philosophy, scholasticism, for example, and St. Thomas Aquinas was probably the major player there in the medieval period, going on towards 1000, 1100, 1200 AD. However, before that, a new system of government came into play, and this was feudalism, and this spread through Europe, including England. Feudalism was a bit like the Amway system. It enabled the king to keep control by allocating or gifting land to his major nobles, to the people he wanted to keep strong control connections with. He would allocate large parcels of land. They would sub-allocate them, going down in a hierarchical fashion, so that those who received those parcels of land owed allegiance again to them. They could manage this in a hierarchical way. The only problem is, right at the bottom, the peasants and the serfs got a very small allocation of land and were virtually slaves, which eventually they didn't like and rebelled against. And this is a little like the ones who come in at the bottom of any hierarchical system find there's not much left for them. The ones at the top get all the benefits. But anyway, feudalism and manorialism, which made the manor or that sort of particular fiefdom sort of self-sufficient, worked reasonably well for a while and consolidated the power of monarchs. And also the church became a major player in this as well. Christianity had developed very strongly since Rome, since the Roman Empire had adopted it and developed its own structures. The papacy, for example, and also the monastic system had developed at this stage as well. And they'd gone through a number of reform processes, but most importantly they linked with the Franks, with the major German tribes. Charlemagne, for example, was the major king who developed this alliance between the church and the German tribes, or Germany, and that became known as the Holy Roman Empire, Germany and Italy combined. So gradually they pulled themselves out of this trough that they were in Western Europe, out of the so-called Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, into the period of medieval culture and eventually beyond. Viewers, during the medieval period, from the 10th to the 13th century, there were dreams of unifying Europe, of a unified model of Europe. And at the same time, there was a great deal of
work on the philosophical side, particularly, as I mentioned, from St. Thomas Aquinas and the Scholastics. The Scholastics tried to unify, or did unify, all knowledge at that time under the auspices of God. Everything had to be interpreted in terms of theology, in other words. And that included all the early work of the early philosophy of the Greeks, particularly Aristotle. So there was a great sort of period of unification that went on there, and also there was a establishment of educational institutions such as universities, because the monastic institutions had been outgrown. There was a great surge in and a need for wider education, but still within that theological scholastic framework. Feudalism, of course, was the go. It was the model that was being applied by kings to try to keep control of their territories, of their many empires and nations and so forth. But it was really over the next period, the period, if you like, from about the 13th to the 15th century, that civilization really got a move on. Kings found that, for example, that to have absolute authority, the medieval feudal model didn't quite work, because the feudal nobles, the major landowners, were getting too powerful. So there was great conflict. There was also conflict with the church. So we see in the period from the 13th, 14th, 15th and 16th centuries, again we come to a great crossroads. Huge changes. First of all, in the model of governance. This was the period when the nation-states first emerged, the real nations that we know today, with absolute monarchies, if you like. The power of the feudal landlords had been broken during this period, and so Spain, England, France, Germany, etc. emerged as states, nation-states in their own right, unified through common language, usually, common culture. And also it was a period of great discovery, because again, underneath at the information level, through this period, there was a huge growth in knowledge, a huge growth in scientific knowledge, for example. There were improvements in cartography, map making. There were improvements in, for example, the ability to measure time, and that led to the ability to measure more accurately longitude, latitudes, etc. It meant that seafarers had more confidence in their maps, and the boats were getting bigger and stronger as well. There was a differential now between the European world and the other worlds, which were only just really, which had developed sophisticated empires in their own right, but were fairly isolated, such as the Maya and the Aztecs and the Incas in America, and other groups elsewhere, for example, India and China. So there was this differential, and the West capitalised on it. So we have the great voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama actually found the sea route around the Cape, Good Hope around Africa, through to the East Indies, to India, and further on to the East Indies. Opened up enormous trade routes. This is arguably the greatest voyage of discovery ever made. It was 3 times as far as Columbus went across to the Americas. But it changed the scope of the world. It changed it away from the Mediterranean region to the Atlantic region, the Indian Ocean region. So humans were now truly global travellers. And in that process, of course, began colonisation. Once the wealth of these new worlds was recognised, then initially not only the Spaniards conquered the Aztecs and the Incas, but all of Western Europe set forth to have their share, to colonise these lesser developed countries, and to gain the great wealth that accrued from these major voyages and colonisation. Now, so we have at the same time then a growth, the beginnings or major beginnings of new capitalism within Western Europe. Capitalism, of course, had started and been reasonably developed in the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire particularly, but it took on a new surge with all this increased wealth that was coming from the new territories, the colonised territories, the Crusades, and generally the expanding trade in Europe at large. So these were massive developments, and had large ramifications in their own right, because the nation state not only needed to be a unified state politically with power in the monarch, breaking the power of the nobles, if you like, and the feudal landlords, but also increasing the power of the middle classes. And there needed to be a unified economic model at the same time to match this political model. Viewers, we see a new pattern emerging now, a speed up, if you like, in the process of information flows and knowledge discovery. New discoveries driven by, for example, in science, Newton, Galileo, Kepler, prior to that Copernicus discovering the heliocentric model of the solar system. Also, new knowledge about social institutions such as democratic institutions, which were driven by the emergence of the nation states, just as the new capitalist economics was as well. So we see each of these things compounding, and it flows through to the 18th century. It flows through because now the speed up is so great that there are revolutions and social requirements outstrip the existing availability of equity. So there's the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and then the Industrial Revolution, driven by the new discoveries again in science, steam power, electrical power, eventually. But originally those new discoveries in science that changed the whole map of the workplace. So all these revolutions occurred coming into the 17th, 18th centuries and beyond, so that we will see in our next program how these new developments, how this new speed up, this new pattern towards greater complexity, greater information flows, as well as population flows by this time, which were greatly expanding, produces a new threshold, a new and quite dangerous threshold as we go into the 20th century. I'm David Tao, and you've been watching the Theories of Everything program again. I'll look forward to speaking to you again next week.